It was a night that glittered with wealth. The tall glass walls of Vale Enterprises shimmered like crystal, reflecting the lights of the city. Inside, laughter echoed through the hall as waiters weaved between guests holding champagne and canapés. The air smelled of perfume, money, and pride. Everyone there was dressed like success itself. At the center of it all stood Richard Vale, the man everyone came to see, the man whose fortune was large enough to make others feel small. His tailored suit seemed almost part of him, his silver watch glinting whenever he raised his glass. He was the kind of man who believed life was a game, and he always had to win. The company's quarterly success party was his favorite kind of event, full of attention, power, and the sound of people laughing at his jokes even when they weren't funny. But in the corner of the marble floor, away from the glow of the chandeliers, a quiet figure worked with his head down. Eli Turner, the night janitor, pushed his mop in slow, careful strokes. His uniform was clean but faded from too many washes. He didn't look up when people brushed past him. He knew his place in this world, unseen, unnoticed. His job was to clean up the mess others left behind, both literally and figuratively. Still, he carried himself with quiet patience. He never interrupted, never stared. Even when some guests looked at him like he didn't belong, he just kept working. He needed this job. He needed every cent of it. As the evening went on, the noise in the room grew louder. Richard stood near the grand piano that sat in the lobby, a beautiful black Steinway that was more decoration than instrument. He never played it, but it made his building look more cultured, as he liked to say. Who even knows how to play these things anymore? He joked loudly, resting a hand on the glossy surface. A few of his friends laughed. You'd think music like this was for another century. Everyone just listens to machines now. One of his guests, a business partner trying to impress him, laughed too hard. Maybe the janitor knows how to play, he said, nodding toward Eli, who was still mopping near the entrance. The room chuckled. Richard turned, grinning. The janitor? He looked Eli up and down as if the idea was absurd. Tell me, my friend, he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Can you play this thing? Eli froze. His hands tightened on the mop handle. He didn't answer right away. He could feel every pair of eyes on him. He hated attention. It made him feel small. But something inside him stirred at the question. I used to play, he said softly, almost to himself. Richard tilted his head, pretending to be curious. Used to play, huh? He said, stepping closer. Tell you what, how about we make it interesting? The crowd grew quieter, waiting. Richard always loved to put on a show. If you can play something worth hearing, he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement, I'll marry the next woman who walks through that door. The guests burst into laughter. Someone actually clapped. It was just another one of Richard's careless challenges, the kind that made people laugh and reminded everyone that he could say whatever he wanted. Eli looked at him, eyes calm, but tired. That's not something to joke about, he said quietly. Richard smiled like a man who thought he was untouchable. Oh, come on, he said. It's just a bit of fun. Lighten up, unless, of course, you're scared to try. A few people giggled. The laughter stung more than the words. Eli set the mop aside and looked toward the piano. It had been years since he'd touched real keys, years since he'd heard the sound of a note echo in a room. His hand still remembered, even if his life had forgotten. But he didn't move. Not here. Not for them. Instead, he gave a small shake of his head and said, My job's to clean floors, sir. Not entertain people. Then he picked up his mop again. The crowd laughed louder, and Richard lifted his glass in mock salute. Wise choice, he said. I'd hate to see the mop outplay the millionaire. That made everyone laugh even harder. Eli's ears burned, but he stayed silent. He had learned long ago that pride didn't feed anyone. After the laughter faded and the music returned, the janitor went back to his quiet work. The party continued, full of noise and empty praise. But somewhere inside, something in Eli had shifted, like a locked door opening just a crack. When the night ended, and the last guests left, he began his usual cleaning routine. The floor was sticky from spilled drinks, and confetti clung to the corners. The silence was heavy, the kind that only comes after too much laughter. He wheeled his cart toward the piano, wiping the floor around it carefully. His reflection stared back at him in the black surface. He could almost see the boy he once was, sitting in a small apartment beside his mother's old upright piano, pressing the same key over and over until the sound was perfect. He could almost smell the varnish, hear his mother's voice saying, "Play from your heart, Eli, not from your hands." He touched one of the keys gently. It made a soft sound, slightly out of tune but still pure. He pressed another, then another. The sound filled the empty room. He didn't notice the security camera above, still recording as always. The melody that came was hesitant, fragile, like something that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Then it grew, steadier, fuller. It wasn't a performance, it was a memory. Every note carried the weight of things he'd lost, his parents, his home, the life that had slipped away. He played only for himself. Outside the office doors, Richard's assistant, Clara, was gathering the leftover paperwork from the meeting rooms. She stopped when she heard the music drifting through the hall. For a moment, she thought someone had turned on the sound system again, but when she peeked through the glass, she froze. There was the janitor sitting at the grand piano, eyes closed, lost in the music. His hands moved with grace and speed, every motion filled with emotion. It was unlike anything she had ever heard in that cold building. She took out her phone and quietly hit record. She didn't know why, maybe it was instinct, maybe it was awe. But something about the way he played made her chest tighten. When he finished, the sound faded into silence. Eli stood up quickly, almost ashamed, and picked up his mop again. He didn't know anyone had heard him. Clara slipped away, holding her phone close. She couldn't stop replaying it in her head. That sound, that man, that moment. The next morning, the video would spread faster than she could imagine. But that was tomorrow's story. For now, in that quiet lobby, a janitor had reminded the night that beauty can still live in forgotten places. And somewhere deep in the marble echoes of that building, a billionaire's careless words were about to become the beginning of something he'd never forget. The next morning, the office building was buzzing. People weren't talking about work. They were whispering about a video that showed the janitor, the same quiet man they had all ignored, sitting at the grand piano, playing like someone born for it. The sound that filled the room in that recording didn't belong to a man who mopped floors for a living. It belonged to someone who had lived through beauty and pain. It was delicate but powerful, sad but full of life. Even people who didn't care about classical music found themselves replaying it again and again. No one knew who had filmed it. Some said the security cameras caught it. Others said a staff member had posted it. But within hours, the video had spread all over social media. People were calling him the janitor pianist. By noon, the building's lobby was different. When Eli arrived for his evening shift, he noticed how people looked at him, not with indifference but with curiosity. Some nodded. Others smiled awkwardly. A few even whispered his name. It made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being seen. As he clocked in, Clara walked toward him. She looked nervous, holding her phone tightly. "Eli, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked gently. He stopped, unsure. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head quickly. "No, nothing's wrong. It's just, there's something you should see." She showed him her phone screen. There he was, and sitting at the piano, his hands moving across the keys, his head slightly bowed. The post already had hundreds of thousands of views. Eli stared at it in shock. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "I recorded it," Clara admitted quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. It was just so beautiful and I wanted people to hear it. I didn't know it would spread like this." He looked down, unsure how to feel. "People shouldn't be watching me like that," he said. "That was private." "I know," she said softly. "But maybe it's not a bad thing. People are saying your music touched them. Look." She scrolled through the comments. There were thousands. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Who is this man? He should be performing on stage, not cleaning floors." This brought me to tears. Eli couldn't believe it. All he ever wanted was to stay invisible, to get through each day quietly. Now somehow the world had found him. "Please take it down," he said quietly. "I can try," Clara said, "but it's already been shared everywhere." "It's out of my hands now," he sighed. "Then let it be." That night as he cleaned, the piano stood silently in the corner again. But now it felt different, almost alive, like it remembered the music that had awakened it. Eli tried to ignore it, but his eyes kept drifting toward it. He didn't want fame. He didn't want people's pity. He just wanted to do his job and go home to his sister. Home was a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were thin and the furniture old. but it was clean and warm. His younger sister, Lily, waited for him every night. She was in her wheelchair reading a book when he came in. "You're late," she said with a smile. "Did someone spill another drink?" "Something like that," he said, forcing a grin. He placed a small bag of groceries on the table. "I got you your favorite soup." Her eyes lit up. "You're the best." He watched her eat, feeling that familiar mix of love and worry. She'd been in that wheelchair since the accident. The doctors had said her chances of walking again were slim. He had sold everything, even his piano, to pay for her medical bills. She looked up at him suddenly. "Eli, are you hiding something?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She held up her phone. "You're on the internet. I saw you playing the piano." He froze. "You saw that?" "Everyone has," she said. "It's everywhere." "Why didn't you tell me you played again?" He sat down slowly. "Because I didn't plan to, I just needed to hear the sound again." Her eyes softened. It was beautiful. Mom and Dad would have been so proud. The mention of their parents brought silence. He looked down, remembering the night of the accident, the flashing lights, the hospital, the sound of machines. That was the night everything changed. He had been 17, full of dreams. He had just received his acceptance letter from Juilliard. He was supposed to start his life as a pianist. But instead, he buried his parents and spent years working any job he could to keep a roof over their heads. Music became too painful. Every note reminded him of what he lost. So he stopped, completely. Lily reached out and took his hand. "Maybe this is your chance," she said softly. "People finally see who you are." He shook his head. "They see a story, not a person. They'll forget in a week." But she didn't believe that. Neither did Clara, who spent the next day convincing her boss not to punish Eli for the video. When she mentioned the idea of a charity concert, Richard laughed. "A concert? For the janitor?" he said with a smirk. "Don't tell me you're serious." "People love him," Clara said firmly. "Our company's name is already tied to the video. This could actually help our reputation, and maybe help him too." Richard leaned back, thinking. He liked good publicity. He liked control even more. "Fine," he said finally. "If he wants to play, let him play. We'll host it right here in the building. Call it a community event." He smiled to himself, imagining how good it would look for his company. When Clara told Eli, he refused at first. "No," he said. "I'm not doing this for show. That music wasn't meant for crowds. But it could help people," she said gently. "We're raising money for charity, for kids who can't afford music lessons. And maybe it could help your sister too." He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once. "I'll think about it." That night he went back to the piano. The building was empty again, just as before. He sat down and touched the keys carefully, like greeting an old friend. The sound was still there, still warm. He played softly, eyes closed, letting his heart guide him. It wasn't about showing off, it was about remembering. He played the song his mother used to hum while cooking dinner, the one she said always made her feel safe. When he finished, he opened his eyes and saw Clara standing quietly in the doorway, smiling. "That was perfect," she said. "I haven't said yes yet," he replied. She smiled again. "You just did." Over the next few days, preparations began for the concert. Flyers were made. Local newspapers ran the story of the janitor who played the piano like a master. People started leaving small notes for Eli in the lobby, handwritten messages saying thank you, or sharing how the music made them feel. At first, he didn't know what to do with them. But one evening, as he read through a note from a woman who said his music helped her through a hard time, something changed inside him. Maybe this wasn't about him anymore. Maybe the music was bigger than that. Meanwhile, Richard watched from his office, feeling a mix of irritation and curiosity. He didn't understand how a janitor could become more famous than a billionaire overnight. But he wasn't worried. In his mind, everything still revolved around him. The day before the concert, Eli came home to find his sister waiting with her laptop open. "They're talking about you on the news," she said, beaming. "They said your music brings hope." He smiled faintly. "Hope, huh? That's a big word," she nodded. "It fits you." He looked at her, his little sister who never stopped believing in him even when he stopped believing in himself. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the accident. Courage. That night, He practiced until his fingers ached. Every note was a promise, to his parents, to his sister, and maybe even to himself. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. He didn't know how the world would react when he stood before a crowd again. But he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to play, and this time he wouldn't be playing for money, fame, or applause. He would be playing for life itself. The day of the concert came faster than anyone expected. The building, which usually smelled of fresh polish and paper, now buzzed with excitement. Workers moved plants and chairs, arranging them neatly in rows across the marble lobby. A small stage was set up near the grand piano, the same one that had started it all. No one could believe this was happening inside a business tower. Cameras were being set up, reporters moved around with microphones, and employees who had never spoken to the janitor before were now calling him Mr. Turner, like they had always known him. But Eli didn't feel like a star. He sat quietly in the break room, dressed in a simple white shirt. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers twitching slightly from nerves. He could hear the muffled sound of people talking outside, the clicks of cameras, and the low hum of the crowd growing larger. Clara entered the room, holding a small bottle of water. "You okay?" she asked softly. He looked up and managed a small smile. "Just a bit nervous. That's normal," she said. "You'll be amazing," he shook his head. "I haven't played in front of people in years." "What if I make a mistake?" She smiled kindly. "Then you'll keep playing. People don't love your music because it's perfect. They love it because it feels real." That comforted him, even if only a little. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Outside, Richard stood near the front row, shaking hands with a local journalist. He wore his best suit and his most charming smile. Every camera seemed to find him. He liked that. The banner said the concert was sponsored by Vale Enterprises, and that made him feel in control again. He still didn't understand how the janitor's story had taken off the way it did, but if it made the company look generous, he was willing to play along. He told himself it was just good business. When the lights dimmed slightly, a hush fell over the lobby. The crowd turned toward the piano as Eli walked in slowly. His steps were small and careful, his expression calm but focused. He didn't wear a suit or fancy shoes, just his clean shirt and work trousers. It made him look out of place among the polished guests, but somehow, it also made him look more real than anyone there. He stopped by the piano, took a deep breath, and sat down. The microphone picked up the soft sound of him exhaling before he placed his hands on the keys. The first notes were gentle, almost shy. They floated through the room like a whisper. The sound seemed to wrap around the people, softening their voices, quieting their movements. Within moments, the laughter, the clicking, the chatter, all of it faded into silence. Eli's music told a story without words. It was full of longing and love, of sadness and hope. Each note seemed to reach for something just out of reach, like a memory trying to find its way home. People who didn't even like classical music found tears in their eyes. Even Richard, sitting with his confident smile, felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He had never thought about music that way before. To him, life was about numbers, deals, and control. But this sound, this feeling, reminded him of being a boy, when things were simple, when dreams felt possible. When the last note faded, there was a long silence before the applause. It started with one person clapping softly, then another, and then the entire room erupted. People stood cheering, clapping, wiping tears from their eyes. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and for a moment Eli just sat there, breathing slowly, letting it all sink in. He stood and bowed slightly, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. He had finally shared the part of himself he had hidden for so long. Clara ran up to him after the performance, smiling wide. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You really did it," Eli smiled faintly. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "It was the music." That night, videos of the concert flooded the internet. The janitor who played the piano became more than a story. He became an inspiration. People shared his performance with captions like, "Talent can come from anywhere," and "Never judge someone by their job." By morning, he was everywhere. News channels, blogs, and social media. His face, humble and calm, appeared beside words like miracle, hope, and the sound of the human heart. but not everyone was happy. In Richard's office, the mood was different. He watched the news on his large screen, but this time it wasn't his name being praised. It was Eli's. People talked about his kindness, his past, his gift. They called him the man who reminded the world to listen. Richard frowned. The more he heard, the more unsettled he felt. He wasn't used to being in someone else's shadow, especially not someone who used to mop his floors. Still, he told himself it didn't matter. He works for me, Richard muttered under his breath. His story is part of my company's brand now, but deep down something inside him felt smaller than it ever had before. Eli didn't care about the fame. When reporters tried to find him for interviews, he politely declined. When sponsors offered deals, he ignored them. He didn't want money or attention. He only wanted to live quietly again. At home, Lily couldn't stop smiling. She watched every video, every interview about him. "You changed people's lives," she said proudly. He chuckled softly. "I just played the piano," she shook her head. "No, you reminded people that dreams don't die. They just wait." Those words stayed with him for days. Every time he walked into the building, someone new stopped him to say thank you or ask for a picture. It felt strange. He wasn't used to people noticing him. One afternoon, he was called to Richard's office. When he walked in, the billionaire was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city below. "Quite a show you put on," Richard said without turning. Eli nodded once. It wasn't meant to be a show. Richard turned and smiled faintly. "Well, whatever it was, it worked. The company looks great. Donations are pouring in. You made us look good." Eli stayed silent. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm offering you something," he said. "A full-time position. Not as a janitor, as our public representative. You'll attend events, talk about your story, play when needed. I'll pay you well. You'll never have to mop another floor again." Eli looked at him quietly. "And what would I be representing?" "Hope," Richard said smoothly. "Second chances. The human spirit. You'd be perfect for it." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said simply. Richard blinked. "No? I don't play for image," Eli said. "I play for meaning. I won't be part of a performance that's about money." For a moment, the room was silent. Richard's jaw tightened. "You realize you're turning down an opportunity most people would beg for?" Eli nodded calmly. "Yes, but I'm not most people." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the billionaire standing there, silent, stunned and strangely hollow. That night, Clara found Eli back in the lobby, sitting by the piano again. "You really told him no?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I've spent my whole life trying to do the right thing for others. But if I lose who I am, then none of it matters." She smiled, proud of him. "You're something else, you know that?" He laughed softly. "Just a janitor who loves music." "Not anymore," she said. "You're proof that kindness still matters." The next few days passed quietly. The noise online slowly faded, as it always does. But for those who had seen him play, something remained, a memory that didn't disappear with the scroll of a screen. People came to the building sometimes just to look at the piano, to feel the air where he once played. And in every reflection of the polished floor there was a reminder. Greatness doesn't always come dressed in suits or fame. Sometimes it comes in work clothes and quiet hearts. One night, long after everyone had gone home, Eli sat at the piano again. The lights were dim, the city outside glowing softly through the glass. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play, not for the world, not for applause, but for peace. The music floated through the empty hall, warm and alive. And as the notes rose and fell, they carried a message that no words could ever capture. That even in silence, the soul can sing, and somewhere in that same building, behind a glass office door, a man who once mocked him sat listening in the dark, wondering for the first time what it really meant to be rich. The days after the concert felt strange for everyone. The building that once buzzed with business now carried a different kind of energy. People who had never said more than a polite good morning to the janitor now stopped to talk to him. Some asked about his music. Others simply thanked him for reminding them that beauty could live even in the most ordinary places. But not everyone felt at ease with the new attention. Especially Richard. He tried to pretend he didn't care, but the more people talked about Eli, the more uncomfortable he became. He wasn't used to being in the background. Every newspaper headline mentioned the janitor pianist, not the billionaire who owned the building. Every video that went viral had Eli's face, not his. For a man who had spent his whole life chasing success, it felt strange to realize that someone with nothing had stolen the world's heart. In his office, Richard sat behind his desk scrolling through article after article. Each headline sounded the same. The humble genius, the man who played from his soul, the music that stopped the city. He sighed and leaned back. All this over one song, he muttered. Clara stood near the doorway. She had learned not to argue with him when he was in this mood, but she couldn't help herself this time. It wasn't just one song, she said quietly. It was what it meant to people. It reminded them to feel something again. Richard looked at her unimpressed. People feel too much. That's why they never make it to the top. She frowned. Maybe being at the top isn't everything. He didn't reply. He just waved his hand for her to leave, but her words stayed with him longer than he expected. Meanwhile, Eli had gone back to his normal work routine. He still cleaned the floors, emptied the trash bins, and fixed the lights. The fame didn't change how he lived. He liked it that way. When people asked why he didn't quit his job, he would smile and say, "Music feeds the soul, but work keeps the heart humble." Most of the staff respected him even more for that. He never acted superior, never bragged. If anything, he became quieter, as if all the noise around him didn't touch him at all. But outside the building, things were very different. Messages poured in from around the world. People wanted to invite him to play at concerts, talk shows, and charity events. A famous record producer even sent him a letter saying his music had a soul that couldn't be taught. When Clara showed him the letter, he just shook his head. "I'm not ready for all that," he said. "I just wanted to play once to remember who I was." She smiled softly. Maybe the world needs to remember too. He thought about that, but he wasn't sure. Fame never appealed to him. He had seen how it could turn people into something else, something they weren't meant to be. One evening, while Eli was polishing the piano, Richard came down from his office. It was unusual for him to walk through the lobby so late. The room was quiet except for the faint echo of the mop bucket rolling across the floor. Richard stopped a few feet away from Eli. For a moment, neither spoke. Then finally, Richard said, "You turned down the record deal?" Eli nodded. "I did." "Why?" Richard asked, his tone half curious, half annoyed. "You could have made a fortune." Eli wiped the piano keys gently. "Money isn't the reason I play." Richard smirked. "That's what poor people always say." Eli paused and looked up at him. His voice was calm but firm. "Maybe, but it's also what free people say." That answer caught Richard off guard. For the first time, he didn't have a clever reply. He turned and walked away, but that one line stayed with him all night. Later that week, another story broke online. It wasn't just about the concert anymore. Someone had dug into Eli's past. They found out about the accident that took his parents, the years of sacrifice, the sister he had cared for alone. The news spread fast, and soon everyone knew the pain behind his music. Reporters began showing up outside his apartment waiting for a glimpse of him. His sister felt nervous seeing strangers outside their door, but Eli stayed calm. "They'll get bored soon," he said gently. He never blamed anyone. Not even the people who published his story without asking. Clara, however, was furious. "They had no right to do that," she said. "Your life isn't their property." Eli smiled faintly. "It's all right. If it helps someone understand why music matters, then maybe it's not so bad." His kindness amazed her. She had worked in that building for years, surrounded by people who thought only of themselves. Yet this man, the one everyone once ignored, had more grace than all of them combined. A few days later, a well-known television network offered to do a special program about him. They promised it would be respectful, about hope and perseverance. Clara encouraged him to accept, but he hesitated. "I don't want to be a story," he said. "I just want to live." Still, he agreed to do one short interview as long as it focused on music and not his personal life. When the program aired, millions watched. The host asked him what kept him going through all his struggles. Eli thought for a moment and said, "Love. For my family. For the music. For life itself. When you love something enough, even pain can turn into a song." That single line became one of the most shared quotes of the year. People printed it on posters, shared it online, even used it in school speeches. He didn't ask for any of it, but somehow he had become a symbol of quiet strength. Richard watched the interview alone in his office. For the first time, he saw Eli not as a janitor or an employee, but as a man who had something he didn't: peace. The next morning, Richard called Clara into his office. "Set up a meeting with him," he said. When Eli arrived, Richard looked more serious than usual. "I want to make things right," he said. "You deserve more than a janitor's wage. From now on, you'll have a permanent position here. Music consultant, whatever you want to call it. You'll have your own space and you can play whenever you want." Eli smiled politely. "That's generous, but I don't need a title to do what I love." Richard frowned. "You're a hard man to help, you know that?" Eli chuckled softly. "Maybe I just don't want help that comes with strings." That response made Richard sigh, but for once he didn't argue. "Fine," he said. "Then play something for me. No cameras. No audience. Just us." Eli looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He sat at the piano and began to play. The melody was slow and thoughtful, almost like a conversation without words. As the notes filled the air, Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't think about money, status, or control. He just listened. When the song ended, the room stayed quiet. Richard opened his eyes and said softly, "You play like you're speaking to something bigger than all of this." Eli nodded. "Maybe I am." After that day, something changed between them. They didn't become friends exactly, but the wall of arrogance that once stood between them began to crack. Richard started greeting people in the lobby instead of walking past them. He began staying late at night not to work but to listen, and Eli kept playing. Not every night, but often enough that the building began to feel alive again. The guards would pause their rounds just to hear a few minutes of it. Cleaners stopped their work to listen. Even visitors noticed something different. A calmness in the air. A warmth they couldn't explain. It wasn't long before people started calling it the building that breathes music. One evening, Clara told Eli, "Do you realize what you've done? You've changed this place. You've changed him too." He smiled gently. "Music changes everything it touches. I'm just lucky to be part of it." As she walked away, she looked back and saw him sitting at the piano, lost in thought. The lights reflected off the keys, and his shadow stretched long across the marble floor, quiet, steady, and full of grace. And up in his office, Richard stood by the window, watching the man below. For once, he didn't feel envy. He felt something far better: gratitude. He realized that the janitor he once mocked had given him something his millions never could: a reason to listen again. And from that night on, whenever Eli played, the sound carried beyond the glass walls, drifting into the city streets like a promise that beauty could rise even from the humblest hands. Weeks passed, and the building settled into a new rhythm. The music that once echoed through the halls had become a part of everyday life. It was no longer a surprise to hear the faint sound of piano notes rising softly from the lobby in the evenings. People had begun timing their breaks just to catch those moments, but something deeper had changed too. The workers smiled more, greeted each other more warmly, and even the long days felt lighter. All because one man chose to play. Eli had never asked for attention, but now wherever he went, people wanted to talk to him. Some shared their stories, how his music helped them through loneliness or loss. Others asked for advice, thinking he might have all the answers. He didn't. He only knew that every person carried a song inside them. Some just forgot how to hear it. One evening, as he was packing up his cleaning cart, a young man from the security team approached. "Sir," he said shyly, "I've been trying to learn piano, but I can't afford lessons. Do you think you could teach me? Just a little?" Eli smiled. "Of course. But you don't need lessons to start. You just need to listen." The next day he showed the young man a few simple chords. Then another worker joined, and soon there were 3, then 5. Every evening after work they gathered around the piano. Eli guided them patiently, laughing when they hit the wrong notes, encouraging them to keep trying. Before long, the lobby became a small music room after hours. The staff called it the night class. Clara often stayed late just to watch. There was something special about the sight. Men and women in uniforms, tired from a long day, sitting together to make music with their hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. One night, as Eli was leaving, she stopped him by the elevator. "You know," she said softly, "you've built something rare here. It's not just about music anymore, it's about people believing in themselves again. He smiled modestly. All I did was open the door. They walked through it. Upstairs, Richard had noticed the changes, too. At first, he didn't understand why people were staying later, or why there was laughter echoing in the halls after closing hours. But when he finally went down one night to see for himself, what he found left him speechless. He stood quietly near the back of the lobby, watching his employees gathered around the piano. They were laughing, singing softly, even clapping along. And in the middle of it all was Eli, patient, kind, completely at peace. Richard stayed there for almost an hour unnoticed. When he finally went back upstairs, he didn't feel like the owner anymore. He felt like a student, someone who had just learned a lesson he didn't know he needed. The next morning, he called a meeting. "We're going to start something new," he announced. "A company music night open to everyone. Once a month. The piano stays in the lobby, and anyone who wants to play or sing can do it." The staff exchanged surprised glances. It was the first time Richard had ever suggested something that wasn't about business or profit. Clara smiled to herself. She knew exactly who had inspired him. The first music night was simple, just a few performances, some snacks, and a lot of nervous laughter. But by the second month, word had spread. More people came, even from other companies in the building. Some brought instruments. Others just came to listen, and always at the end they asked Eli to play. Each time he chose a different song, sometimes joyful, sometimes tender, always meaningful. His music carried a quiet power that brought everyone together. Even those who didn't understand music could feel it. After one performance, Richard walked up to him and said, "You've done more for this company than I ever have." Eli shook his head. "You gave people a place to come together. That's something too." Richard looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe. But you showed me what that place could become." It was a rare moment of humility, and for once Eli didn't try to deflect it. He just nodded with a gentle smile. As the months went on, invitations started coming in from far away. Concert halls, foundations, even international festivals. Some offered large sums of money for Eli to perform. He turned most of them down. But one invitation stood out. It came from a charity that built music schools for underprivileged children. He read the letter several times before deciding. Finally, he agreed to play, but only if the concert raised funds for the children directly. When he told Clara and Richard, both were surprised, but in different ways. Clara smiled proudly while Richard frowned, worried. "You sure you can handle all that attention?" he asked. Eli nodded calmly. "It's not about me. It's about giving back what music gave me." The night of the charity concert arrived. The hall was full. People from every walk of life sat side by side, waiting for the man who had once been a janitor to play again. When Eli walked onto the stage, there was no spotlight, no grand entrance. Just silence. Then the quiet sound of him sitting down at the piano. He looked at the audience, smiled, and said softly, "This one is for anyone who's ever been told they're not enough." Then he began to play. The melody started soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper of doubt. But as it grew, the music turned hopeful, strong, clear, full of life. Each note carried a message of resilience, of rising after falling, of believing again. People in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Some closed their eyes completely just to feel it more deeply. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then came the applause, long, thunderous, heartfelt. Eli stood up, bowed once, and quietly left the stage. He didn't wait for praise or interviews. For him, the performance was already complete when the first note had touched someone's heart. Later that night, as he stepped outside into the cool air, he found Richard waiting by the car. "That was—" Richard began, then stopped, unable to find the right words. Eli chuckled softly. "Music says what words can't," Richard nodded. "I suppose it does." After a pause, he added, "You've changed my life, you know. Before you came here, I thought success meant control. Now I think it means connection." Eli smiled. "That's the most valuable thing you've ever learned." They stood there in silence for a moment, watching the city lights. It was a quiet understanding between two men who had started in opposite worlds but somehow met in the middle. In the following weeks, the charity reported record donations. Dozens of children were able to join the music program because of that single concert. Eli didn't take any of the credit. He said the music belonged to everyone who listened. Back at the building, things continued to grow. The piano nights became a local tradition. People who had never played before began to learn. Visitors would stop to take photos, but most stayed just to feel the atmosphere. Clara often said, "This place used to echo with footsteps. Now it echoes with hope." Eli kept teaching the night class even though his name was known across the city now. Fame never changed him. It only made him more determined to lift others. One evening, as he sat alone by the piano, Clara walked up and said, "You know, everyone's been talking about how much you've given us. But I think you're still holding something back." He looked at her, curious. "What do you mean?" "You've helped everyone find their song," she said softly. "But what about yours? The one that's only yours?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly. "Maybe that one's still being written." She nodded, understanding. "Then I hope I get to hear it one day." He didn't answer. But his fingers brushed the keys, playing a few soft notes. Simple, unfinished but full of promise. That night, as the last echoes faded into the still air, something about the sound felt different. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning of something yet to come, something that would reach even further than any concert hall ever could. The years rolled by gently, like pages turning in a book no one wanted to finish. The building that once echoed with hurried footsteps and the sound of closing doors had become something else entirely. It had become a home for stories. Stories of people who found courage, hope, and connection through one man's quiet gift. Eli still worked there, though not as a janitor anymore. His title didn't matter, but his presence did. He was the heart of the place. The piano in the lobby was no longer just a decoration. It was a part of everyone's routine. Morning greetings, evening gatherings, even short breaks between work. Sometimes visitors would walk in and look around in surprise, wondering why everyone seemed so calm, so friendly. The answer always led back to one thing: the music. Eli never stopped teaching. The night class grew bigger every year. People came from other buildings just to sit in, even if it was only to listen. What had started as a simple act of kindness had become a quiet movement, one that reminded everyone that beauty doesn't belong only to the rich or talented. It belongs to anyone who feels deeply enough to share it. Clara often teased him, saying, "You know, you could be performing on the biggest stages in the world right now." He would smile and reply, "Maybe, but those stages already have enough stars. This place still needs its light." She'd always laugh, but deep down she knew he meant it. Richard, too, had changed more than anyone would have ever believed. The cold, proud billionaire had turned into someone who actually listened. He no longer saw success as a trophy. He started new programs for his employees: free art classes, scholarships, music clubs, even family events. He often told people, "A company is only as strong as the joy inside its walls." And whenever someone asked where he got that idea, he would smile slightly and glance toward the lobby piano. As the years went on, Eli's music continued to spread, not through fame or headlines, but through people. One of his former students became a music teacher at a local school. Another started playing at hospitals, comforting patients. One young man even began composing his own songs, inspired by Eli's lessons. Eli watched them all with quiet pride. "That's how music lives forever," he once told Clara. "Not in recordings, but in hearts." But time, as it always does, kept moving. One winter evening, the city was covered in soft white snow. The building glowed warmly against the cold, the golden light spilling out onto the street. Inside, a small crowd had gathered around the piano. It was the annual winter music night, a tradition that had started many years ago and never stopped. Eli was supposed to open the night with a song, but this time, he asked one of his students to take his place. He sat among the listeners instead, smiling as the young man began to play. The melody was simple but beautiful, full of feeling. As Eli listened, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet realization that life had come full circle. Once, he had been the one playing to prove himself. Now he played through others. When the performance ended, the audience clapped warmly. The young man looked at Eli, his eyes bright with gratitude. Eli nodded approvingly, then whispered, "That was beautiful. Never stop playing." After the event ended, most people left, but Eli stayed behind. The building was quiet again. Snow fell softly outside, the streets nearly empty. He walked up to the piano and ran his fingers gently over the keys. Clara approached him from behind. "You didn't play tonight?" she said softly. He smiled without turning around. "I didn't need to." They played what I would have said anyway. She stepped closer. "You should still play one last time, for yourself." He looked at her then, his eyes warm. "Maybe you're right." He sat down and began to play. The song was slow and tender, full of memory. Every note carried a story. The early mornings cleaning floors, the night the billionaire mocked him, the moment his music silenced the crowd, the laughter of students learning their first chords. The melody seemed to travel beyond the walls out into the snowy night. Even the guards at the door paused to listen. There was something about that tune, something final, yet comforting. When the last note faded, Clara blinked back tears. "What was that piece called?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It doesn't have a name. Some things are meant to just be felt." A few days later, Eli caught a cold. It didn't seem serious at first, but the winter was harsh that year. Clara and Richard made sure he stayed home to rest, bringing him soup and checking on him often. He would always thank them gently and say, "Don't worry, I've had harder days." Still, everyone missed him at the building. The piano sat untouched for weeks, and the halls felt strangely empty without his quiet presence. Then one morning, when the first light touched the city skyline, a message spread quietly among the staff. Eli had passed away peacefully in his sleep. No one spoke much that day. The news hit like a soft, heavy silence. Some cried, some prayed, others just stood by the piano not knowing what to say. Richard closed his office and came down to the lobby. He stood there for a long time looking at the piano, the same one where it had all begun. Then he placed his hand on it and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, the staff decided to gather together. No speeches, no ceremony, just music. One by one, they took turns playing, each person sharing the song Eli had once taught them. The janitors, the guards, the office clerks, even the young man who'd performed at the winter event. All of them played, and somehow every note seemed to blend perfectly. It was as if Eli's spirit was still there, guiding their hands. Clara sat near the front, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she was smiling, because even though he was gone, his gift remained, not just in the piano, but in the people he had touched. Later that night, Richard announced something. "From now on," he said softly, "this building will have a music scholarship in his name. Every year we'll help one young person chase their dream." That's what he would have wanted. Everyone nodded, some crying quietly, others clapping through their tears. And so the Eli Foundation for Music and Hope was born. Over the next few years, it grew beyond anyone's expectations. Children who couldn't afford lessons were given pianos, guitars, and teachers. Concerts were held every summer to raise funds. Every time the foundation helped a new student, someone would say, "He'd be smiling right now." And they were right. The building never went silent again. The piano remained in the same spot, its surface polished and its keys always warm from being played. On the wall above it, there was a small plaque that read, "Play this cone and remember why you began." Those words became the heart of everything. Visitors would stop to read them. Some would sit down and play. Others would just close their eyes and listen. Years later, when Richard grew old, he often sat by that piano for hours just listening. Sometimes he'd talk softly, as if Eli could still hear him. "You were right, old friend," he'd say. It was never about money. It was about meaning. And every once in a while, when the sun dipped low and the lobby filled with that golden light, it almost felt like Eli was there again. Hands gliding across the keys, head tilted slightly, eyes closed in peace. The music lived on, not in fame, but in the everyday kindness between people, in laughter, in courage, in hope. And so the story of the janitor who once silenced a billionaire didn't end with applause or awards. It ended with something far more powerful. A world made a little softer, a little better, because one man chose to play.